The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Upper East Side apartment, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that had taken me 3 years to afford. I stood before my full-length mirror, adjusting the collar of my vintage Chanel blazer for the 3rd time, my reflection revealing the nervous energy I was trying so hard to suppress. The annual spring charitable luncheon at the Meridian Country Club wasn't just another social event. It was Manhattan's most exclusive gathering, where old money whispered behind crystal champagne flutes and new money tried desperately to prove their worth. I'd been attending for 3 years now, ever since my nonprofit's unexpected success had earned me a grudging invitation to this inner circle of privilege and power. My grandmother would have laughed at the irony. Rosa Martinez, who'd spent 60 years kneading dough before dawn in her small bakery in Queens, would have found it hilarious that her granddaughter now worried about fitting in with women who'd never worked a day in their lives. But Abuela had also taught me that success meant nothing if you forgot where you came from, and that respect was earned, not inherited. I reached for my handbag, a stunning midnight blue Hermes Birkin with rose gold hardware that caught the morning light like jewelry. The weight of it felt reassuring in my hands, solid, substantial, real. I'd saved for 18 months to buy it, denying myself small luxuries and working late into countless evenings to afford this one magnificent extravagance. It wasn't just an accessory to me. It was a symbol of how far I'd traveled from that cramped apartment above Abuela's bakery, where the smell of fresh bread mixed with the sounds of the city awakening below. The bag represented my first $1 million fundraising milestone, the moment when Children's Educational Equity Network had transformed from a passionate idea into a legitimate force for change. Every time I carried it, I remembered that board meeting where I'd presented our first annual report, watching skeptical faces transform into expressions of genuine respect as I detailed our impact on over 3,000 students in underserved communities across New York City. But today felt different. Today carried the weight of announcement, of transformation, of the next chapter in a story I'd been writing one small victory at a time. The partnerships I'd been negotiating in secret for 8 months were finally ready to be revealed. Goldman Sachs, McKinsey & Company, the Ford Foundation, names that had once seemed impossibly out of reach were now committed to funding our expansion into 5 new cities. $12 million over 3 years, numbers that still made my head spin when I thought about them. I applied my lipstick with steady hands, choosing the deep red that Abuela had always said made me look like a woman who knew her own mind. The face in the mirror had changed over the past 5 years. Gone was the uncertain graduate student who'd started tutoring kids in the public library. In her place stood a woman who'd learned to navigate boardrooms and fundraising galas, who could present to philanthropists and politicians with equal confidence. Yet underneath the professional polish, the girl from Queens remained. She whispered reminders about staying humble, about remembering that success was a responsibility, not a reward. She carried the voices of every student we'd helped, every parent who'd thanked us for giving their child a chance they'd never had themselves.
The cab ride to the club took 20 minutes through Manhattan traffic that seemed lighter than usual, as if the city itself was making way for what felt like a pivotal day. I watched the familiar landmarks roll past, the Met, the Frick Collection, the elegant brownstones that housed families whose names appeared on museum wings and hospital foundations. This was a world I'd studied from the outside for years, learning its rhythms and rules, understanding that acceptance here meant more than social approval. It meant access to resources that could change lives on a scale I'd barely dared to imagine. The Meridian Country Club occupied an entire block on the Upper East Side, its limestone facade speaking of old money and older traditions. As my cab pulled up to the entrance, I saw the familiar sight of town cars and drivers waiting for their employers, the discreet luxury that marked these gatherings. The doorman, a dignified gentleman named Charles, who'd been greeting members for over 30 years, nodded respectfully as I approached. "Good afternoon, Miss Blackwell," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine recognition. "Beautiful day for the luncheon." "Indeed it is, Charles. Thank you." Charles had been one of my first allies in this rarefied world, treating me with the same courtesy he showed to women whose families had been members for generations. In a place where staff often reflected the attitudes of their employers, his consistent kindness had meant more than he probably realized. The club's interior was a masterpiece of understated elegance, marble floors worn smooth by decades of use, oil paintings of long-dead members in ornate frames, fresh flowers arranged with the kind of casual perfection that required enormous skill and expense. The air carried the scent of history and privilege, leather and wood polish, and the faint trace of expensive perfume. I made my way toward the ivory-draped dining room where the luncheon would be held, my heels clicking against the marble in a rhythm that seemed to announce my arrival. Other guests were already gathering, their conversations creating a gentle hum of anticipation. I recognized many faces, women I'd worked with on various committees, philanthropists whose support had been crucial to our growth, socialites whose approval could make or break a charity's reputation in this insular world. The dining room itself was breathtaking, transformed for the occasion with arrangements of white roses and baby's breath that must have cost more than most people's rent. Crystal glasses caught the light from enormous chandeliers, and the soft clink of silverware against china created a symphony of refined civilization. This was where Manhattan's elite gathered to decide which causes deserved their attention and their money, where reputations were built or destroyed over luncheon conversations. I paused at the entrance, taking in the scene and feeling the familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety that these events always produced. Somewhere in this room were the people who would determine whether our expansion succeeded or failed, whether thousands of additional students would receive the support they needed to break cycles of poverty and limitation. My handbag felt heavier than usual, weighted not just with its own luxury but with the significance of this moment. In a few hours, I would stand before these influential women and announce the most ambitious expansion in our organization's history. The partnerships we'd secured would allow us to reach students in Chicago, Detroit, Atlanta, Phoenix, and Houston, cities where educational inequity ran as deep as anywhere in the country. But first, I had to navigate the social minefield that preceded every serious conversation in this world, the careful dance of pleasantries and positioning, the subtle ways that alliances were formed and hierarchies established. I'd learned to read the currents in these rooms, to understand that seemingly casual conversations often carried enormous weight.
"Laura, darling." The voice that cut through the gentle din was unmistakably Victoria Ashworth's, carrying across the room like wind chimes in a thunderstorm. Perfectly pitched, artificially sweet, and somehow always managing to sound condescending despite the endearment. I turned to see her gliding toward me, her signature pearls catching the light like captured moonbeams. Victoria moved through these spaces with the fluid confidence of someone who'd never doubted her right to be anywhere she chose to go. She was flanked by her usual coterie of socialite shadows, women who seemed to exist in her orbit, reflecting her light while never quite achieving their own luminescence. "Victoria," I replied, offering a genuine smile despite my reservations about the woman approaching me. "You look absolutely radiant." She did look radiant, I had to admit, impeccably dressed in cream Oscar de la Renta that probably cost more than many people's cars, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon that had likely required 2 hours and a small army of professionals to achieve. Every detail was coordinated to perfection. The shoes, the jewelry, the subtle makeup that enhanced rather than concealed. Victoria Ashworth had been born into this world of privilege and expectation, and it showed in every gesture, every carefully modulated word, every assumption that the world would rearrange itself to accommodate her desires. "Shall we find our table?" she suggested, linking her arm through mine with the kind of proprietary friendliness that made my skin crawl. The gesture was calculated to suggest intimacy while establishing dominance, marking me as someone who required her guidance and protection. "I'm simply dying to hear about your little organization. How absolutely admirable, working with, what is it again? Underprivileged children?" The slight pause before underprivileged and the way she said, little organization were carefully chosen diminishments, subtle ways of reducing something significant to something quaint and manageable. I'd learned to recognize these verbal sleights of hand, the way certain people could make compliments feel like condescension. Educational equity, I corrected gently, maintaining my smile while clarifying the distinction. We provide comprehensive tutoring, mentorship, and college preparation programs for students in underserved communities across the city. Of course. How wonderful, Madison chimed in, though her tone suggested she found it anything but wonderful. Such important work. So, grassroots. The word grassroots carried its own subtle dismissal, suggesting something amateur and small-scale rather than professional and impactful. These women had perfected the art of praising with faint dams, of making charitable work sound like a hobby rather than a calling. We settled at our assigned table, strategically positioned to provide optimal views of both the podium, where speakers would present, and the room's most influential occupants. The seating arrangement was no accident. In this world, proximity to power was itself a form of currency, and table assignments were studied like stock reports by those who understood their significance. The conversation flowed around topics I'd grown accustomed to in these circles, a predictable rotation of concerns and interests that rarely varied from event to event. Summer house renovations that cost more than most people's annual salaries, upcoming galas that would raise millions for causes these women barely understood, children's prestigious internships at companies their fathers owned or influenced, the eternal question of which charity deserved their tax-deductible attention this season, usually answered based on which cause offered the most social visibility rather than the greatest impact. I participated when required, contributing observations and anecdotes that demonstrated my familiarity with their world, while never losing sight of my own values. The ability to speak their language without adopting their assumptions had taken years to develop, requiring careful observation and considerable restraint. My mind wandered to the afternoon's real purpose, the announcement that would transform our entire organization and, more importantly, the lives of thousands of students who didn't even know they were about to receive unprecedented opportunities. The partnerships we'd secured represented years of work, countless meetings, and more rejection letters than I cared to remember. Each no had been a learning experience, teaching me how to refine my approach and strengthen my case. The breakthrough had come 6 months ago, when a program officer at the Ford Foundation had seen one of our annual reports and reached out to discuss our methodology. That conversation had led to others, each building on the last, until we found ourselves in serious negotiations with organizations whose support could change everything. Goldman Sachs had been interested in our financial literacy components, seeing potential for a program that could address economic inequality at its educational roots. McKinsey had been drawn to our data-driven approach and our measurable outcomes, recognizing that we'd solved problems they'd been studying for years. The Ford Foundation had seen the scalability of our model and the opportunity to create lasting change across multiple cities. Together, they'd committed to funding an expansion that would allow us to reach students in 5 new cities, establishing programs that could serve as models for national replication. The numbers were staggering, not just the financial commitment, but the potential impact on young lives that would otherwise be limited by circumstances beyond their control. "Laura, that's such an interesting bag," Penelope said suddenly, her voice cutting through my reverie like a blade. The table fell silent with an abruptness that made the sudden attention feel almost violent. All eyes turned to my Birkin, and I felt the weight of their scrutiny like a physical pressure. Something in Penelope's tone made every nerve in my body alert. The slight emphasis on interesting, the way the other women's expressions sharpened with anticipation, the quality of silence that suggested predators circling prey. This wasn't casual admiration or friendly curiosity. This was something else entirely. It's a Birkin, I said simply, adjusting the bag's position on the table while maintaining eye contact with Penelope. I treated myself when we reached our first major funding milestone. "Oh, a Birkin!" Victoria exclaimed, leaning forward with exaggerated interest that felt more like aggressive curiosity. "How absolutely lovely, though I have to say the hardware looks a bit distinctive. Don't you think so, girls?" The word distinctive carried the weight of judgment, suggesting something that deviated from accepted norms. Madison nodded thoughtfully, as if she were a connoisseur examining a questionable piece of art. "The rose gold does seem quite bright," she observed, her tone suggesting she was making a reluctant but necessary observation. "And the leather texture," she trailed off, allowing the implication to hang in the air like smoke. Alexandra examined the bag more closely, her expression shifting into what I recognized as her courtroom mode, the focused attention of someone building a case. The stitching pattern is quite interesting, too. Very creative interpretation of the classic design. Heat began to rise in my cheeks as I realized what was happening. These women weren't admiring my bag or making casual observations about its appearance. They were systematically dismantling its authenticity, finding flaws and inconsistencies, building a case for its illegitimacy. The careful way they phrased their observations, the meaningful glances exchanged between them, the slight smirks playing at the corners of their mouths, it all pointed to a coordinated effort to humiliate me. The realization hit me like cold water. They had made a judgment about me and my bag before they've even sat down, deciding that someone of my background couldn't possibly own an authentic Hermès piece. Everything that followed was confirmation bias, seeing what they expected to see rather than what was actually there. "I'm not sure what you're implying," I said, though I knew exactly what they were implying. My voice remained steady, despite the anger building in my chest. Victoria's laugh was like crystal breaking, sharp and sudden and somehow violent. "Oh, darling, we're not implying anything at all. It's just that when you've been collecting authentic pieces for as long as we have, you develop quite an eye for variations." "Variations," Penelope repeated, savoring the word like fine wine. "Such a diplomatic way to put it, Victoria." "Of course, there's nothing wrong with a good reproduction," Madison added quickly, her voice dripping with false reassurance. "Some of them are remarkably well made these days, almost indistinguishable from the real thing to the untrained eye." The word reproduction hit me like a physical blow. They were calling my bag a fake, and they were doing it in the middle of Manhattan's most exclusive social gathering, surrounded by the city's elite, in full view of people whose opinions could make or break careers and reputations. The humiliation was designed to be complete and public. In this world, authenticity wasn't just about possessions, it was about legitimacy, about belonging, about the right to occupy space among the truly elite. By questioning my bag's authenticity, they were questioning my entire presence in their world. "I can assure you it's completely authentic. I purchased it directly from the Hermès boutique on Madison Avenue." "Oh, Madison Avenue," Alexandra said with a knowing nod that suggested she was humoring a child. Though I suppose there are so many little shops on that street now, some more legitimate than others. The implication was clear and insulting. They were suggesting I'd been duped by some sketchy knockoff dealer, that I was either naive enough to be fooled or desperate enough to knowingly buy a counterfeit and try to pass it off as genuine. Either way, I was being painted as a fraud, a pretender trying to fake her way into their world with counterfeit credentials.
The flagship Hermès store, I clarified, my patience wearing thin as I felt the eyes of neighboring tables beginning to turn in our direction. "The one that's been there for decades?" "Of course," Victoria said, though her tone made it clear she didn't believe a word I was saying. "Well, regardless of where it came from, it's quite
Bold of you to carry it here. Bold, as if bringing a fake designer bag to their precious luncheon was some kind of social transgression worthy of public shaming. As if I were some kind of confident artist trying to infiltrate their rarefied world with fraudulent credentials and counterfeit accessories. Other women at nearby tables had begun to notice the commotion, their own conversations pausing as they sensed the delicious possibility of scandal. Whispered conversations stopped mid-sentence as curious glances were cast in our direction. I could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the anticipation of social drama that seemed to electrify these gatherings like lightning in the air. "The craftsmanship really is quite impressive," Penelope continued, reaching out to touch the bag's leather with the presumptuous familiarity of someone who believed her opinion carried more weight than my ownership. "You can barely tell it's not authentic." That casual violation of my personal property, combined with her absolute certainty that she was right and I was wrong, shattered whatever remained of my composure. The condescending tone, the public humiliation, the assumption that I was either a liar or a fool, it all crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. These women had made their judgment based on nothing more than their own prejudices and assumptions. They'd looked at me and decided I couldn't possibly belong in their world, couldn't possibly afford authentic luxury, couldn't possibly be anything more than a pretender trying to buy acceptance with counterfeit goods. What they didn't know was that I had resources they couldn't imagine, connections they hadn't considered, and a direct line to someone who could settle this matter once and for all. I pulled my phone from the bag's interior pocket, my fingers moving with deliberate precision, while the four women watched with expressions of superior amusement. They thought they'd won, that they'd successfully exposed me as a fraud and put me in my place. They had no idea what was about to happen. I found the contact I was looking for and quickly typed a message. "Hey Emma, weird question, but can you settle something for me? I'm at a luncheon and these women are insisting my Birkin is fake. I'm sending a pic. Can you verify it's authentic?" I attached a clear photo of the bag, making sure to capture the hardware, leather texture, and stitching that had been criticized. Then I hit send and waited. The response came back within seconds. "What? Laura, that's absolutely completely authentic. I literally watched you buy it at our Madison Ave store last year. I was there when Francois finished it. Who the hell is saying it's fake?" A smile began to form at the corners of my mouth as I read Emma's response. My college roommate from Columbia, the woman who'd shared ramen noodles and late-night study sessions with me for 4 years, had always been protective of our friendship. She was also, as of 2 years ago, the chief executive officer of Hermes North America. "Everything all right, dear?" Victoria asked, noticing my suddenly improved mood. "Just checking on something," I replied, typing another quick message to Emma. "Actually, could you do me a huge favor? I'm at the Meridian Country Club, and these women are being pretty nasty about it. Can someone from the store verify it officially? I think they need to hear it from a professional." Emma's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Oh, hell no. Nobody messes with my girl's authentic Hermes. This is about to become these women's worst nightmare. Give me 5 minutes." I set my phone aside and looked around the table at the 4 women who'd spent the last 15 minutes systematically attempting to humiliate me. They were still smirking, still basking in their perceived superiority, still completely convinced they'd successfully exposed some pathetic social climber trying to fake her way into their exclusive circle. "You know," I said, conversationally, settling back in my chair with newfound confidence, "it's fascinating how certain people can be so absolutely convinced about things they don't actually know much about." Victoria's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched in a way that suggested I was providing entertainment rather than making a serious point. "I beg your pardon?" Expertise. The difference between real expertise and assumed expertise. Between actually knowing something and just thinking you know something because you've been told you're supposed to know it. I'm not sure I follow, Madison said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Something in my tone had shifted, and she was beginning to sense that the dynamic in our table was changing. Well, for instance, I said, gesturing toward my bag, you've all spent considerable time examining this piece and declared it fake based on your supposed expertise in authentic Hermès craftsmanship. But I'm curious, has anyone here actually worked with the brand? Studied their manufacturing processes? Spoke directly with their craftspeople? Spent time in their workshops? The table fell silent. The women exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier confidence beginning to crack like expensive veneer under pressure. Or are you basing your expert opinions on what you've heard from other people who also aren't actually experts, on assumptions and prejudices rather than knowledge? I think we know quality when we see it, Penelope said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. The absolute certainty of moments before was beginning to waver. Do you? I asked, leaning forward slightly. Because I'm curious about something. You mentioned the rose gold hardware looking too bright, too new. But did you know that Hermès actually introduced a new rose gold alloy in their limited edition pieces 18 months ago? It has a completely different finish than their standard hardware, brighter, more lustrous, designed to catch light differently. Victoria's smile faltered slightly, the first crack in her perfect composure. Well, of course there are variations in their production. And the leather, I continued, enjoying the way their expressions were changing. You found the texture unusual, different from what you expected. But this particular bag is made from what Hermès calls Novillo leather, which has a distinctive grain pattern that's different from their standard Togo leather. It's used exclusively for certain special orders and limited editions. The women were no longer smirking. Uncertainty had crept into their expressions, and the absolute confidence of moments before was being replaced by something that looked suspiciously like doubt. The stitching pattern that seems so creative and non-traditional to you, I pressed on. It's actually called saddle stitching, and it's a signature technique that Hermès has used for over a century. Each bag is hand-stitched by a single craftsperson who spends 18 to 24 hours on each piece. The slight variations you noticed aren't flaws. They're proof of hand craftsmanship. I could see doubt blooming in their eyes now, the casual dismissal being replaced by the uncomfortable realization that perhaps they weren't the experts they'd claimed to be. The women who were so certain of their superior knowledge were beginning to understand that their assumptions might have been wrong. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Store manager is personally driving over. This is going to be epic. These women have no idea what's about to hit them.
The thing about authenticity, I said, savoring the moment, is that it's not always about what looks right to people who think they know better. Sometimes it's about provenance, about documentation, about having actual proof rather than just confident assumptions and social prejudices. Well, of course, documentation is important, Alexandra said stiffly, her judicial training making her instinctively retreat to procedural ground. But visual authentication is also a perfectly valid method of... She was interrupted by a commotion near the dining room entrance. A well-dressed man in an impeccable navy suit was speaking urgently to the maitre d', gesturing in our direction with the kind of authority that suggested he was accustomed to having his requests accommodated immediately. The maitre d' nodded deferentially and began leading him through the maze of tables toward us. "Are you expecting someone?" Victoria asked, her social radar detecting the approaching disruption to their carefully ordered world. In this environment, unexpected arrivals were either very good news or very bad news, and the expressions on the women's faces suggested they were beginning to suspect which category this fell into. "As a matter of fact, I am," I replied, standing as the man reached our table. The other women remained seated, but their posture had shifted, becoming more alert and defensive. The approaching figure was tall and distinguished, with graying temples and the kind of understated elegance that spoke of genuine luxury, rather than its imitation. His seat was perfectly tailored, probably Savile Row, and his shoes were obviously custom-made. He carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being listened to, whose opinions carried weight in rooms where important decisions were made. "Miss Blackwell?" he asked, though his eyes had already found my bag on the table and his expression had shifted into something that might have been recognition. "That's me." "James Morrison, General Manager of Hermès Madison Avenue," he said, extending his hand with a warm smile that was directed entirely at me. "I apologize for interrupting your luncheon, but I understand there's been some question about the authenticity of your Birkin bag." The silence at our table was deafening. Every conversation in the immediate vicinity had stopped, the room's attention drawn to what was clearly about to become the social event of the season. I could feel dozens of eyes trained on our little drama, society matrons and their daughters craning their necks to witness what was obviously going to be either a spectacular vindication or a devastating exposure. "There has indeed been some question," I confirmed, shaking his hand while maintaining eye contact with the 4 women who had systematically attempted to humiliate me. Mr. Morrison reached into his briefcase and withdrew a leather portfolio that looked as expensive as most people's cars. "He's brought the complete documentation for your specific piece. Would you mind if I examined it briefly to confirm the details?" "Not at all," I said, lifting the bag and handing it to him with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. He handled it with the reverence of someone who truly understood its value, turning it over in his hands with practiced expertise, examining the hardware with the kind of detailed attention that came from years of working with these pieces. His movements were precise and professional, the actions of someone who'd spent decades distinguishing authentic luxury from its imitations. "Beautiful work," he murmured, opening the interior to check the date stamp and craftsperson's signature. "This is from our November collection last year. Novio leather in Blue Nuit with rose gold hardware from our new alloy series. Quite rare, actually. We only produced 12 pieces in this specific configuration worldwide." He opened his portfolio and withdrew several documents, spreading them carefully on the table where everyone could see them. "Here we have the original purchase receipt, the certificate of authenticity, the craftsperson's completion documentation, and the quality control verification. This bag was completed by master craftsman François Dubois at our atelier in Paris and sold at our Madison Avenue location on November 15th of last year to Miss Laura Blackwell." He turned to address the table at large, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet of the dining room. "I want to assure everyone present that this is absolutely, unquestionably, an authentic Hermès Birkin bag. Not only is it authentic, but it's one of our most exclusive pieces from that season, part of a very limited production run that we offered only to our most valued clients." Victoria's face had gone completely pale. Madison was staring at the documents in Mr. Morrison's hands as if they were written in a foreign language she couldn't understand. Penelope looked like she might be physically ill, and Alexandra was examining her manicure with the intense focus of someone trying to pretend she wasn't witnessing her own humiliation. "Furthermore," Mr. Morrison continued, his voice taking on a more formal tone, "I want to personally apologize to Miss Blackwell for any confusion or distress that may have been caused by questions regarding her bag's authenticity. Hermès stands firmly behind the quality and legitimacy of every piece we sell, and we take any challenge to that authenticity very seriously." He reached into his briefcase again and withdrew a small, elegantly wrapped box that bore the distinctive Hermès ribbon. "As a token of our appreciation for your continued patronage, and to make amends for today's unfortunate incident, we'd like to present you with this complimentary accessory from our new limited edition collection. I accepted the box, acutely aware that every person in the dining room was watching this unprecedented scene unfold. In the rarefied world of Manhattan society, public apologies from luxury brand executives were as rare as honest politicians. This was the kind of moment that would be discussed at dinner parties for months to come. "That's incredibly generous," I said, "but really not necessary." "I absolutely insist," Mr. Morrison replied with the kind of firmness that suggested the matter was not open for debate. "Word travels very quickly in our industry, and we simply cannot have anyone questioning the authenticity of pieces purchased from our boutiques. Your reputation is our reputation, and we protect both zealously." I unwrapped the box with hands that were steadier than I felt, revealing a stunning silk scarf whose pattern was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The design was a modern interpretation of Hermès's classic equestrian themes, rendered in jewel tones that seemed to shift and change in the light. Even someone with my limited knowledge of the brand could tell that this wasn't something from their regular collection. "It's absolutely beautiful," I breathed, genuinely moved by the gesture. "That's from our upcoming autumn collection," Mr. Morrison explained, his voice carrying the pride of someone discussing a work of art. "It won't be available to the public for another 6 months, and we've only produced 50 pieces worldwide. The design is by our head silk designer, inspired by the relationship between power and grace." He gathered his documents and returned them to his briefcase with the methodical precision of someone who understood the importance of proper documentation. Once again, my sincerest apologies for any inconvenience this situation may have caused. Please don't hesitate to contact me personally if you need anything in the future. With that, he shook my hand again, nodded politely to the stunned women at my table, and made his way back through the dining room. The buzz of conversation that followed his departure was like a dam bursting, the suppressed energy of dozens of witnessed social drama finally finding its release. I sat back down, carefully folding the exclusive scarf and placing it next to my thoroughly authenticated Birkin bag. The 4 women who had spent the better part of 30 minutes systematically demolishing my credibility now sat in mortified silence, their earlier confidence replaced by the kind of humiliation that would follow them through this social circle for months to come. "Well," I said pleasantly, smoothing the scarf's silk with gentle fingers, "that was certainly illuminating." The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire, filled with the weight of witnessed humiliation and the shifting dynamics of social power. Victoria Ashworth, who had never in her 63 years been publicly corrected, sat frozen in her chair like a museum piece, suddenly aware of its own obsolescence. "Lara," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper, there seems to have been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," I repeated thoughtfully, savoring the word. "Is that what we're calling it?" The restaurant around us had returned to its normal volume, but I was acutely aware that we remained the subject of many whispered conversations. Word of what had just happened would spread through Manhattan's social circles before the dessert course was served, becoming the kind of story that would be told and retold at dinner parties for months to come. "We certainly didn't mean to imply," Madison began, then trailed off, apparently unable to finish the sentence without admitting the full extent of their intended humiliation. "Didn't mean to imply what?" I asked, my voice carrying a steel that these women had never heard from me before. That my bag was fake? That I was either lying about where I bought it or too naive to know I'd been scammed? That I was trying to infiltrate your social circle with counterfeit credentials? The accuracy of my summary made them all wince visibly. Penelope's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the flush of embarrassment that had crept up her neck, and Alexandra's judicial composure had completely cracked. We thought," Penelope stammered, her pharmaceutical heiress confidence reduced to adolescent uncertainty. "You thought what?"
I pressed, not willing to let them retreat into vague explanations and face-saving euphemisms, that someone like me couldn't possibly own an authentic Hermes bag, that my success wasn't real enough, wasn't old enough, wasn't good enough to deserve a place at this table. Alexandra finally found her voice, drawing on her courtroom experience to attempt damage control. That's not what we meant at all, Lara. We were simply what? I interrupted, my patience for their backtracking completely exhausted, because from where I was sitting, it seemed like you'd made up your minds about me and my bag before you'd even examined it properly. You saw what you expected to see, not what was actually there. The truth of this accusation hung in the air like smoke. These women who prided themselves on their sophistication and discernment had been revealed as operating from pure prejudice rather than knowledge. I think, Victoria said carefully, her voice struggling to regain its usual authority, there may have been some misinterpretation of our comments. I laughed, and the sound surprised even me. It wasn't bitter or angry, just genuinely amused by the desperate attempt at revisionism that was unfolding before my eyes.
Misinterpretation? I repeated, shaking my head. Victoria, you literally used the word reproduction. Madison suggested I'd bought it from some illegitimate shop. Penelope physically handled my bag while declaring it fake. Alexandra compared it to a creative interpretation of the classic design. Exactly which part of that did I misinterpret? The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle clink of crystal and silver from surrounding tables, the sounds of a civilized meal continuing around us while our little corner of the dining room dealt with the aftermath of social catastrophe. Perhaps, I continued, my voice taking on the tone I used when addressing my board of directors, the real lesson here isn't about handbags at all. Perhaps it's about assumptions, about the danger of thinking you know everything about someone based on limited information, about the difference between confidence and competence. I stood slowly, gathering my authenticated bag and my exclusive new scarf, aware that every movement was being watched by both my table mates and the curious observers throughout the room. I hope you'll excuse me, I said with perfect politeness. I need to prepare for my presentation this afternoon. Your presentation? Victoria asked weakly, as if she'd forgotten there was a reason for this gathering beyond social performance and hierarchy maintenance. I am announcing a major expansion of my organization today, I explained, allowing a note of pride to enter my voice. We're partnering with Goldman Sachs, McKinsey & Company, and the Ford Foundation to bring educational equity programs to 5 new cities. The funding commitment is $12 million over 3 years. The numbers hit them like physical blows. $12 million was serious money, even by the standards of this room. It represented the kind of success and influence that commanded respect in their world, the kind of achievement that couldn't be dismissed or diminished by questions about accessories or authenticity. That's absolutely wonderful, Madison managed, her voice hollow with the realization of what she'd just tried to destroy. It is, I agreed. And do you know what the most satisfying part is? We earned it. Every dollar, every partnership, every opportunity. We didn't inherit it, marry into it, or fake our way into it. We built something real from nothing, and now we're going to help thousands of children build their own futures. I paused, letting that sink in while the women at my table grappled with the implications of their behavior. That's authenticity. Not the designer bag, not the social connections, not the pedigree. The work, the results, the impact on real lives. As I turned to leave, Victoria called after me, her voice cracking with something that might have been genuine remorse, mixed with dawning horror at what she'd just attempted to do. Laura, wait, please. I turned back, studying her face. The perfect composure had completely cracked, revealing something that looked suspiciously like genuine remorse mixed with dawning horror at what she'd just attempted to do. We owe you an apology, a real apology, not just for the bag, but for how we treated you, for who we showed ourselves to be. The admission hung in the air like a confession, raw and unexpected in its honesty.
You're absolutely right, she continued, her words coming faster now as if a dam had burst. We made assumptions. Terrible, unfair, unkind assumptions. We let our own insecurities color our judgment. Insecurities? I asked, genuinely curious about this unexpected vulnerability. Victoria's smile was rueful, tinged with a self-awareness I'd never seen from her before. You've accomplished something genuinely meaningful, Laura, something that matters. You've built an organization that actually changes lives, that makes a real difference in the world. Meanwhile, we sit here planning fundraising galas for charities we don't really understand, serving on boards where our primary qualification is our ability to write checks. She looked around the table at her companions, who were nodding with varying degrees of discomfort and recognition. I think, she said slowly, as if the words were being pulled from some deep place, we saw someone who truly earned their place at this table, really earned it through merit and hard work, and we felt threatened. So we looked for ways to diminish you, to find flaws, to prove that you didn't really belong here. The honesty of her admission caught me completely off guard. I'd expected defensiveness, excuse-making, perhaps a grudging acknowledgement of error. I hadn't expected this level of self-awareness, this willingness to examine her own motivations and find them wanting. But we were wrong, I said gently. We were absolutely, completely wrong, Madison agreed, her voice thick with shame. About the bag, about you, about everything. Penelope nodded vigorously, tears threatening to spill over her carefully applied mascara. I feel sick about how we behaved. It was petty and mean and completely inexcusable. And revealing, Alexandra added quietly, her judicial training making her confront the evidence of their own character. We showed you exactly who we are when we feel threatened, and it wasn't pretty. I set my bag down and sat back in my chair, genuinely moved by their admission. These women had humiliated me publicly, questioned my integrity, and attempted to undermine my standing in this community. They'd revealed themselves to be exactly the kind of privileged, judgmental people I'd always feared I'd encounter in these circles. But they'd also just done something I'd rarely seen in this world of carefully managed images and protected reputations. They'd admitted they were wrong, not just technically wrong about the bag's authenticity, but fundamentally wrong in their approach, their assumptions, their behavior. In a society built on the principle that admitting error was weakness, they'd chosen vulnerability over face-saving. You know what the truly ironic thing is? I said, my voice softer now. I was terrified to come to these events when I first got invited 3 years ago. I was convinced everyone would see right through me, would know I didn't belong, would spot me as an imposter trying to fake my way into your world. But you do belong here, Victoria said firmly, her voice carrying a conviction that seemed to surprise even her. More than most of us, honestly, you've earned your place in ways we never have. That's what I realized today, watching you all examine my bag. You weren't seeing through some facade I was putting up. You were creating one. You decided I was fake and then looked for evidence to support that decision. But the bag was real, my success is real, and my place here is real. I picked up the scarf Mr. Morrison had given me, running my fingers over the silk that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. This is beautiful, and I'm honored to have it, but I don't need it to validate me. Just like I don't need this bag to prove I've made it. They're just things. Beautiful, expensive things, but things nonetheless. Then why did it matter so much to defend the bag's authenticity? Penelope asked, her voice small but genuinely curious. Because it wasn't about the bag, I explained, meeting her eyes. It was about the principle, about not letting people dismiss me based on their prejudices and assumptions, about standing up for truth even when it's uncomfortable, even when it would be easier to just let it slide. I stood again, this time with a sense of closure rather than escape. I accept your apologies, all of them, and I genuinely hope we can move forward from here with better understanding of each other."
"We'd like that very much," Victoria said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. "And Laura, we'd love to hear more about your organization. Perhaps we could arrange a proper presentation for some of the other board members and foundation trustees we know." The offer was genuine, I could tell. These women controlled access to millions of dollars in charitable funding, served on the boards of foundations and cultural institutions, had the power to open doors that had been closed to me before today. "I'd be honored," I said, meaning it. As I walked away from the table, I heard Victoria's voice behind me, addressing her companions in a tone that carried clearly across the immediate area. "Ladies, I think we just learned a very valuable lesson about authentic versus artificial, and I am not talking about handbags." The rest of the luncheon passed in a blur of meaningful conversations and strategic connections. Word of the morning's drama had spread through the room with the speed that only truly scandalous gossip could achieve, but the story being told wasn't the one Victoria and her friends had intended to create. Instead of a tale about an imposter being exposed, the narrative that emerged was one of prejudice being confronted and corrected, of authentic achievement being recognized and celebrated. The women who approached me during the social hour before the presentation weren't looking for weakness to exploit, but strength to admire. "I heard what happened earlier," whispered Margaret Pemberton, the museum board chair, whose approval could make or break cultural initiatives throughout the city. "Good for you, standing up for yourself like that. It's about time someone called out that kind of behavior." Similar conversations played out throughout the room. Women who had witnessed the scene or heard about it from others expressed their support with a warmth I'd never experienced at these events before. The attempted humiliation had backfired spectacularly, transforming me from an outsider trying to fit in into a respected member of the community who had earned her place through merit rather than inheritance. When the time came for the afternoon presentation, I stood before an audience of Manhattan's most influential philanthropists with a confidence I'd never felt before. The morning's events had burned away the last of my imposter syndrome, leaving behind a clarity of purpose that made my words ring with conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying easily through the hushed dining room. 3 years ago, I stood in a classroom in Queens watching a brilliant 16-year-old girl explain why she couldn't apply to college, not because she wasn't smart enough, not because she wasn't motivated enough, but because she didn't know how to navigate the application process and her family couldn't afford the preparation she needed. I paused, letting the image settle in their minds. That girl's name was Maria Santos, and she's now a sophomore at Columbia University studying biomedical engineering. She's not the exception, she's the rule. Our students don't lack talent or ambition, they lack access. The presentation that followed was the culmination of months of preparation, but it felt effortless. I outlined our methodology, shared our success stories, and painted a vision of educational equity that resonated with people who had the power to make it reality. Today, I'm proud to announce that Children's Educational Equity Network is expanding to 5 new cities. Thanks to unprecedented partnerships with Goldman Sachs, McKinsey & Company, and the Ford Foundation, we'll be bringing our programs to Chicago, Detroit, Atlanta, Phoenix, and Houston. The applause that followed was enthusiastic and sustained, but I wasn't finished. "The funding commitment is $12 million over 3 years," I announced, watching the assembled philanthropists do the mental math. But more importantly, it represents the opportunity to reach 15,000 additional students, to change the trajectory of 15,000 lives, to prove that educational equity isn't just an ideal, it's an achievable goal. I spent the next 20 minutes detailing our expansion plans, explaining how our model could be replicated and scaled, demonstrating the return on investment that came from giving brilliant young people the tools they needed to succeed. The questions that followed were insightful and engaged, coming from people who understood both the challenge and the opportunity. But the moment that meant the most came afterward, when Victoria Ashworth stood before the assembled crowd and made an announcement of her own. "Before we conclude today's program," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention, "I want to take a moment to address something that happened earlier." A murmur ran through the crowd. Public self-criticism was virtually unheard of in these circles, where maintaining face was considered more important than maintaining integrity. "Several of us made serious errors in judgment today," Victoria continued, her voice steady despite the discomfort of public confession. "We questioned not just the authenticity of Miss Blackwell's possessions, but implicitly, her right to be here among us." The room fell completely silent. This was unprecedented territory, and everyone present understood they were witnessing something historic. "In doing so, we revealed our own inauthenticity," she continued. "We allowed our assumptions and insecurities to cloud our judgment. We forgot that respect is earned through action, not inherited through circumstance." She turned to look directly at me, her eyes bright with what might have been tears. "Laura Blackwell represents the best of what our community should aspire to: real achievement, meaningful impact, and the kind of authenticity that can't be purchased or inherited. We are not just privileged to have her among us, we are better for her presence." The applause that followed was different from the polite acknowledgement that usually greeted such speeches. It felt genuine, warm, welcoming in a way I'd never experienced in this room before. As the formal program concluded and guests began to mingle, I found myself surrounded by people who wanted to know more about our work, to explore potential partnerships, to understand how they could contribute to our mission. The morning's humiliation had transformed into the afternoon's triumph, but more importantly, it had clarified my own understanding of what authenticity really meant. Later that evening, I sat in my apartment overlooking the city, still processing the day's extraordinary events. The Birkin bag sat on my coffee table, no longer a symbol of achievement, but simply a beautiful object that had played an unexpected role in a larger story about prejudice and redemption. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Heard Morrison's visit went perfectly. Hope you destroyed those awful women." I smiled as I typed back, "Something better. I helped them destroy their own awful assumptions." "Very zen of you. Dinner this weekend? I want to hear everything." "Absolutely. And Emma, thank you for having my back today, for rushing to my defense without even asking questions." "Always, girl. That's what real friendship looks like. Unlike fake bags, it gets better with age." As I set my phone aside, I found myself thinking about the nature of authenticity and what it really meant. The morning had started with questions about a handbag, but it had ended with deeper questions about identity, belonging, and the courage to stand up for yourself when others tried to diminish you. The Birkin was authentic, but that was the least important thing about it. What mattered was that I'd earned it honestly, carried it without apology, and, when challenged, stood my ground with dignity and grace. The silk scarf beside it was beautiful, exclusive, valuable, but the most precious thing I was taking from today wasn't something that could be wrapped in tissue paper or authenticated by experts. It was the knowledge that I belonged exactly where I was, not because of what I carried or wore or owned, but because of who I was and what I'd built. That was authenticity no one could question, counterfeit, or take away. The weeks following the luncheon brought changes I hadn't anticipated. The story of what had happened at the Meridian Country Club spread through Manhattan's social circles like wildfire. But the narrative that emerged wasn't the one Victoria and her friends had originally intended to create. Instead of being remembered as the woman who'd been caught with a fake bag, I became known as the woman who'd stood up to prejudice and won. The attempted humiliation had backfired spectacularly, transforming me from an outsider trying to fit in into a respected member of the community who had earned her place through merit rather than inheritance. 3 days after the luncheon, I received a call from James Morrison at Hermes.
Miss Blackwell, he said, his voice warm with genuine pleasure. I wanted to follow up on our meeting the other day. I've been thinking about your organization and the work you're doing. That's very kind of you, I replied, curious about where this conversation was heading. I'd like to propose a partnership, he continued. Hermes has been looking for meaningful ways to support educational initiatives, and your model seems like exactly what we've been searching for. Would you be interested in discussing a potential collaboration? The partnership that emerged from that conversation exceeded my wildest expectations. Hermes committed to funding scholarship programs in all 5 of our expansion cities with a focus on students interested in design, craftsmanship, and entrepreneurship. The financial commitment was substantial, but the real value was in the doors it opened and the credibility it provided. You know, Morrison told me during one of our planning meetings, what impressed me most about that day at the club wasn't your bag or your documentation. It was your composure under pressure. You could have gotten angry, could have made a scene, could have let their prejudice turn you into someone you weren't. Instead, you remained true to yourself while standing up for what was right. 6 months later, I stood in the same dining room at the Meridian Country Club, but everything had changed. My organization's success had exceeded every projection, earning me invitations to boards and committees I'd only dreamed of joining. The partnerships announced that pivotal day had not only met but surpassed our goals, helping us reach over 20,000 students across 5 cities. But the most significant change was in the relationships I'd built. Victoria Ashworth had become not just an ally, but a genuine friend, someone who'd proven that people could evolve beyond their worst moments. She'd used her considerable influence to introduce me to other philanthropists, foundation heads, and business leaders who could contribute to our cause. Madison, Penelope, and Alexandra had each made their own contributions, using their connections and resources to open doors I couldn't have reached alone. Their initial prejudice had been transformed into advocacy, their assumptions replaced by understanding. I've been thinking about what happened that day, Victoria told me over coffee a few weeks after the anniversary, about why we reacted the way we did, what it revealed about us.
And what did you conclude? I asked. That we were threatened by your authenticity, she said simply. You represented something we'd never been, someone who'd earned her place through merit rather than inheritance. We tried to diminish you because your success highlighted our own insecurities about whether we deserved our positions. She paused, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. But you did something remarkable. Instead of letting our prejudice turn you bitter or angry, you used it as an opportunity to educate us. You showed us who we could be instead of just telling us who we were. Today marked the launch of our newest initiative, a mentorship program pairing successful professionals with students in our programs. The funding had come largely from the network of women who'd once questioned my authenticity, transformed now into some of our most passionate advocates. Ladies and gentlemen, I announced to the assembled crowd, I want to thank everyone who made this expansion possible, but I especially want to acknowledge 4 women who taught me something invaluable about authenticity and redemption. I looked out at Victoria, Madison, Penelope, and Alexandra sitting together at their familiar table, their faces glowing with pride and something that looked like genuine happiness. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. These women showed me that authenticity isn't about perfection. It's about the courage to admit when you're wrong and the determination to do better. The applause that filled the room was warm and sustained, but I wasn't finished. They also taught me that real change happens not when we destroy our enemies, but when we help them become better versions of themselves. That's what education is really about, not just teaching facts and skills, but helping people discover who they're capable of becoming.
As the event concluded and guests began to leave, I found myself standing by the window overlooking Central Park, the same view I'd admired on that first day 3 years ago when I'd felt so uncertain about my place in this world. The Birkin bag hung from my shoulder, no longer a symbol of achievement or authenticity, but simply a beautiful object that had played an unexpected role in a larger story about prejudice, redemption, and the courage to stand up for yourself when others try to diminish you. But around my neck, I wore the silk scarf James Morrison had given me that extraordinary day, the same one I'd worn to every important event since. It had become my favorite accessory, not because of its exclusivity or value, but because of what it represented. A reminder that authenticity, like quality craftsmanship, reveals itself under scrutiny. That real friendship, like genuine luxury, improves with time. And that sometimes the best response to prejudice isn't revenge, but the patient work of helping people become better versions of themselves. "Laura?" Victoria's voice interrupted my thoughts. She approached with a small wrapped package, her expression unusually nervous. "I wanted to give you something," she said, extending the gift. "A token of how much you've changed my life." I unwrapped the package to reveal a vintage Hermes scarf, clearly from decades earlier, its silk still vibrant despite its age. "It was my mother's," Victoria explained. "She always said that true elegance came from within, that the most beautiful accessories were meaningless without authenticity of character. I didn't understand what she meant until I met you." I was genuinely moved by the gesture, understanding the significance of receiving something so personal from someone who'd once tried to publicly humiliate me. "She would have liked you," Victoria continued. "She always said that the best people were those who'd earned their grace through struggle rather than inherited it through luck."
"Thank you," I said, meaning it deeply. "This is incredibly meaningful." "No," Victoria replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for showing me who I could be instead of just accepting who I was, for teaching me that authenticity isn't about what you own or where you come from, but about who you choose to become." 2 years later, I stood before the United Nations General Assembly, delivering a keynote address on educational equity to delegates from around the world. The Children's Educational Equity Network had grown beyond anything I had imagined, operating in 12 cities and serving over 50,000 students annually. The partnerships we'd forged had become models for similar initiatives worldwide. Our methodology was being studied and replicated, our success stories were inspiring policy changes, and our students were attending universities and pursuing careers that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier. But the moment that meant the most to me came afterward, when a young woman approached me during the reception. "Miss Blackwell?" she said, her voice nervous but determined. "I'm Maria Santos. I was one of your first students from the program in Queens." I recognized her immediately, though she'd grown from the uncertain teenager I'd first met into a confident young woman radiating intelligence and purpose. "Maria!" I exclaimed, embracing her warmly. "How wonderful to see you! How are your studies going?" "I'm graduating from Columbia next month," she said, her smile brilliant. "I've been accepted to medical school at Harvard. I wanted to thank you for everything you've done, for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." As we talked, I learned that Maria had become a mentor herself, working with younger students in our program, helping them navigate the same challenges she'd faced. She was planning to return to Queens after medical school to open a clinic serving the community where she'd grown up. "You know what I learned from you?" she said as our conversation drew to a close. "That authenticity isn't about where you come from or what you own. It's about staying true to yourself while working to become the person you're meant to be." Later that evening, I returned to my hotel room and called Emma to share the day's events. "So," she said, after I'd recounted the entire story, Any regrets about that day at the club? About how you handled Victoria and her friends? I considered the question carefully, thinking about everything that had followed from that moment of confrontation and choice. None, I said finally. If I'd gotten angry, if I'd responded with the same prejudice they'd shown me, none of this would have happened. Maria wouldn't be going to Harvard, thousands of other students wouldn't have had the opportunities they've received, and 4 women who'd lived their entire lives guided by assumptions and prejudices wouldn't have discovered who they were capable of becoming. "And the bag?" Emma asked with a laugh. "Still carrying it?" I looked across the room at the Birkin, sitting on the dresser where I'd placed it earlier. It was still beautiful, still perfectly crafted, still authentic in every way that mattered to experts and collectors. "Sometimes," I said. "But you know what? It's not about the bag anymore. It never really was." "What's it about then?" I smiled, thinking about the long journey from that cramped apartment above Abuela's bakery to this moment, addressing world leaders about the power of education to transform lives.
It's about understanding that the most authentic thing you can carry isn't a designer accessory or a prestigious credential. It's the knowledge that you belong exactly where you are, not because of what you own or where you came from, but because of who you've chosen to become and what you've chosen to build. As I prepared for bed, I thought about the silk scarf that had become my favorite accessory. Not the vintage one Victoria had given me, though I treasured that too, but the limited edition piece James Morrison had presented that day at the club. I'd worn it to every important event since, not because of its exclusivity or value, but because of what it represented. A reminder that authenticity, like quality craftsmanship, reveals itself under scrutiny. That real friendship, like genuine luxury, improves with time, and that sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. The next morning, I would fly back to New York to prepare for our next expansion, adding 3 more cities to our network. But tonight, I was content to sit by the window overlooking Manhattan, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The girl from Queens was still there, still whispering reminders about staying humble and remembering where I'd come from, but she was joined now by a chorus of other voices, students whose lives had been changed, colleagues who'd become friends, and yes, even former adversaries who'd become allies. Together, they reminded me that authenticity wasn't about perfection or possessions or pedigree. It was about the courage to be yourself in a world that constantly tried to make you someone else, the determination to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult, and the wisdom to understand that real change happened not when you destroyed your enemies, but when you helped them become better versions of themselves. The Birkin bag was authentic, verified by experts and documented by professionals, but the woman who carried it was authentic too, in ways that mattered more than any certificate or receipt. She'd earned her place through merit, maintained her dignity under pressure, and used her success to lift others up. That was the kind of authenticity that couldn't be counterfeited, questioned, or taken away. It was the kind that got better with age, deeper with experience, and more valuable with every life it touched. In the end, that luncheon had given me something more precious than any designer accessory: the unshakable knowledge that I was exactly where I belonged, carrying exactly who I was meant to be, and that, unlike any material possession, was something that would never go out of style.